Greg, it's good to see you, my friend. It's been too long. I know I released part one, and then everybody's like, "Where in the world is part two?" I'm like, just wait, just sit on it a little longer. So I think it's been a couple of months, but we are glad to have you back, man.
It's great to be back, Ryan. Thank you for having me.
Everything going well in your life? Seems like you're busy.
Yeah, very busy indeed. Yeah, I think last time we spoke, I've been in Hawaii, which was nice, filming
Hmm.
Magnum PI. So
Oh,
that's coming
nice.
out soon. So yeah, that's fun. And the audio
Is that a
book,
series or is that a movie?
it's a series. It was a series when
Okay.
I was a little kid.
Right,
I
of
used to
course. Yeah, I
watch it with
remember that.
Tom Selleck. Yeah, and they rebooted it on CBS a couple of years ago. So yeah, they've tried to stay as true as possible to the original and update many elements of the show to make it a little more contemporary and fun for the younger viewers. And when I say younger, I mean younger than I.
Yeah, yeah. It
Yeah.
seems weird to be in that category well, I'll say it this way, no longer a younger viewer. I feel like I'm young, but then I look in the mirror, I look at my 13-year-old boy, and I'm like, man, I am not. I'm a dad. I'm getting old. I see a little more gray in my beard these days. My bones are aching a little bit more than they probably ought to, and I realize I'm not on the younger side of the equation any longer.
Yeah, I often wonder, and maybe this is a question for someone way more expert than I, at what age do we individually stop growing and entropy sets in, you know? But I think we always carry those younger versions of ourselves in our memory banks. So those many past versions of our childlike selves. And I think as men, I think I mentioned this to you before, as men, we need to let the boy play. And that
Yeah,
we always need to have a little bit of fun, a little bit of adventure, and be silly, and have a laugh.
it's a
Otherwise, we do
weird.
take life too seriously.
Well, it's a weird dichotomy though, because in a lot of ways, and we learn this from the Bible and things like that, that we need to put away childish ways, for example. And we should, as men, we have responsibilities and obligations that I don't think children could shoulder the way that we can, hopefully. But also, you're right. We also do need to play and enjoy and have fun and laugh and tickle and adventure and do all these other things with our wife and our kids and the people we care about. And so it's kind of a weird balancing act in trying to find like where is the happy medium between being an adult and then being able to still play and enjoy life.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, trying to compartmentalize time, to have that boy time or that guy time or man time it's really important that we have that, but we also have to stay true to our responsibilities and not forget time. And keep communicating. Someone said to me recently, they were having a difficult time with their interpersonal relationship, and I said, and it sounded like a grudge match. I'm like, before you hold a grudge, hold a conversation. It may just be the result of a misunderstanding, and
Mm.
so how we communicate and the ways we can move back to communicating with ourselves as well as others, to kind of elevate and enlighten ourselves continually. Remind, I guess, is the word, to remind and request the question. Requestion. There's a
Great
word.
question. I like that. Yeah, you're right though. We take things so seriously that uh, whether we're trying to win an argument with some random emoji on Instagram or just what we have to do in our day-to-day lives, that we can't just realize like we don't have to be right, we don't have to posture, we don't have to maintain these fragile egos that we as men do all the time, and we can just question and explore and be curious. And I think that's actually threatening to a lot of guys because they believe that if they entertain an idea, that they have to embrace the idea. It's like, you don't have to embrace it. You don't have to accept it as universal truth, but shouldn't we entertain and explore the concept? I mean, I've got guests on here that talk to me all the time about things I disagree with, but man, at least I'm willing to listen, at a minimum, listen to what they have to say and maybe open my eyes and possibilities of new thoughts and insights and ideas that will improve my life and other people's as well.
I think that's how we become more intimate with people, is listening with curiosity and sharing to be known. And when I say listen with curiosity, and I have to keep striving to do this as well, is, really stay attuned and tuned in to what the other person is saying. Not halfway through what they've said, you're already readying a response to that. Because we all, I think, the more we The longer we speak, the more thoughts, as we listen to someone, and the longer they speak, the more thoughts are kind of, welling up to be responded to. So you want to remember them, but the more you try and remember them, the more you're not listening to the person who's still talking. So,
Right.
it's like, and then they might interrupt you and you're like, excuse me for talking while you're interrupting me. But it's, conversation, communication. I think it just got harder with modernity and device dependency. And, the 140 characters on Twitter, and, that's no place to have a conversation. That's that point.
Definitely. It's a bit like a dance without knowing the steps, right? Like your partner might or somebody else might, but you don't really. And so you just have to respond in a way. I actually look at that a lot when it comes to jujitsu, and the guys are already rolling their eyes because they talk about jujitsu every time I have a conversation. But like, I don't know what the other player is going to do. And so in a lot of ways, I have to respond and react or anticipate what they might do and try to set them up to do something so I can do something different. But I don't know the script. And I think that's actually exciting if we're willing to let go of it. But too many of us aren't
Mm.
willing to let go, and we have to control and force everything into this, square peg or whatever it may be. And it's a challenge for me for sure. But the more I let go and the more I maintain my curiosity, like you're talking about, the more enjoyable life is at a minimum.
I think you're right, and I think that challenge that you speak of, I'm reminded of Alan Watts, I think, the philosopher, who talks about the two areas in life. He talks about the dance and the music. We listen to a song or we dance to a piece of music. There isn't a finite endpoint. We don't know where we're going to end up because we haven't heard the song before. We haven't done the dance before. There's newness and rich, unique nuance to the novelty of that process. Those patterns, if you will. It's energy moving in waves, particularly if you're doing it with a partner. So those waves move in patterns, and patterns move in rhythms, and a human being is just that, really. Energy, waves, patterns, rhythms, nothing more, nothing less. It's a dance and that choreography. If we allow ourselves to surrender to that, whatever that choreography is in the moment, it's quite, it can be a scary adventure. Will I have my toe stepped on? Will I be able to lead the lady on the dance floor? What are they thinking? Am I dancing well? But ultimately, if you just lose yourself in the moment, and wherever you end up is probably a surprise of, it's about the experience of getting there rather than I knowing where I was going. The joy is in the journey, not the destination.
I totally, one of the questions I get all the time is, where do you see Order of Man going in 5 years? I'm like, I don't even know what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, let alone where this thing is going to go in the next 5 years. And if you would have asked me that question 5, 10 years ago, I would have had a very clear path of where it would go. And then um, I realized very quickly that those plans are futile. Like,
Yeah.
why am I making all these 10-year plans when I have no idea what life is going to present to me? And I think it's good to have a direction, but to have these finely tuned plans that are going to just work under the perfect set of circumstances is just a waste of time.
I think it's good to have goals and to have timelines and to have, tasks. And, I actually use a particular software to task through what I need to do. But I also have to remind myself to not be so stringent that I don't take into account life is in session. The universe has other plans. Sometimes there are opportunities that are afforded that I have to be distracted by because they may be part of a bigger plan in the order of my manlyhoodness. I'm trying to get Order of Man in there. You can hear what I did
It was
there.
well done, well played. Well, look, I mean, I know we could riff and have this conversation. I did want to talk with you about something very specific, because when we had our first conversation, we talked a lot about these issues, but also we started to talk a little bit about your personal experiences, specifically with your children and your family dynamic. And as we talked about this, I know there's so many men who have dealt with uh, parental rights, fatherhood rights, false accusations, dealing with the family court system. And this is something that you've become a real champion for. And in the tune of our conversation, I can't imagine that you even had the slightest idea that it would go this way, but you found yourself in a very, to put it mildly, interesting predicament. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your personal story with your wife and your children, because I think a lot of guys are going to resonate with your story and really be inspired by how you've navigated these waters.
Yeah, great question. I'm happy to share. I mean, they are treacherous, existentially dystopian waters at times. So look, yeah, simply put, I was married for 20 years. I had two young sons, 10 and 8 years old. They were and are the meaning of my life. I love them more than I can express and put into words. And on March 5th, 2015, something catastrophic happened. And I was awakened to a system, to our institutions of governance, our law enforcement, in a way that it's hard for me to still comprehend. I was at home with my sons, playing in the playroom. They were happy I'd taken the afternoon off. And in the span of, well, even less than 24 hours, I was ushered from my home in handcuffs at the behest, I later discovered, of my ex-wife. I was incarcerated for the first of 5 incarcerations, subjected to a temporary restraining order on the basis of a false allegation, became homeless, almost destitute overnight, and watched helplessly as my professional reputation was in many ways irretrievably destroyed, and my sons lost their father for half their childhoods. And I was their emotional rock, if you will. I mean, anyone who knew us and our family knew, and every family has challenges and difficulties, but I was that connected father. I was, I would get them up in the morning and play with them outside, and pack their lunches for school and drop them off at school, and volunteer at school and coach their AYSO, and I would greet them when they came home from school. That was my favorite part of the day, or at least one of 2 favorite parts of the day. The second one being putting them to bed and playing and laughing and singing songs and reading books. And, I cut their umbilical cords. And so to have that catastrophic severing happen so shockingly and so suddenly based on a false allegation. And then to find out that as I crossed the Rubicon from citizen to respondent, which is the name given to the person who is the defendant, if you will, in family law courts in America, similar to the plaintiff, who's the petitioner, the defendant is the respondent. I migrated from a world of presumed innocence and respected privacy to one of assumed guilt and immediate and ruthless judgment. And when I realized, as I tried to navigate this authoritarian maze and this Kafka trap, that I was not alone, it was at once relief to know that I wasn't going crazy, but it was also deeply disturbing to me, and something rose up in me of a mission and purpose to help those affected, not just men and fathers, but women and mothers too, but predominantly our children, the true and only innocence of a family law system that does not offer a presumption of innocence. It's the one branch of our legal system that doesn't. Whereas where there is a massive amount of corruption. I call the subtitle to my book, The Respondent, is the Cartel of Family Law. And they, in effect, showed up on my doorstep and stole my freedom, and kidnapped or dadnapped me or my children, and destroyed my family, shattered my family, and went about picking apart the carcass of it like rabid vultures on autopilot. So that really became my mission, to understand as many aspects of our legal system, our social policies, our social ills, connect with people who've been affected by this, whether it be the farmer in Arkansas or the military vet in Virginia, or the restaurant worker in San Francisco, whether it be the father in Texas, or the mother like Marianne Petrie, who I had on my show, was falsely accused of child abuse, and she was a nurse and she lost her job, she lost her livelihood, she lost access to her children, was thrown in prison and had a heart attack. In any walk of life, in any geographic location, and this is extended through my quest and my shows, through talking to people in India, I've heard from people in South Africa, South America, North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. It seems to be a worldwide cultural phenomenon. And how to find ways to provide immediate relief for people by way of education and information, but also through workshops and programs, but also find ways to affect the system and highlight the impact that it currently has. We have a president in America who is a Catholic, and he's a father, and yet he, I think, is unaware of the policies and the laws that he's enacted and pushed through. For example, the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, how that is being used against families and fathers and mothers and women and children. It's a very difficult, many of these subjects are very difficult to unpack and work through, but ultimately how complicit many of our politicians, and particularly some of our organizations and the charities out there, and particularly the nearly $60 billion a year American divorce machine that's incentivized to keep the presumption of guilt at the expense of families and places profits over parents and cash over kids.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually going to ask, where does this, you talk about the cartel of the family court system, like where this actually stems from and why you believe there's corruption. So you think it's purely profit driven, is that right? Or do you also feel like there is a misguided sense to do right and good? Like, for example, I think about a couple of movements that come to mind right offhand is the Me Too movement, the concept of believe all women, where I think, if you hear that and you look at it on the surface level, there is, I think, in a lot of ways, a desire to protect women in those statements and in those movements. But to your point, they're wielded as weapons against men who are innocent towards this family destruction. You know what I mean? Like, there's no fault of their own, but they're wielded as weapons against men.
Yes, super weapons. I mean, in particular, just going back to some of the questions and answers that inspired me to look deeper. Who is the world leader in children growing up in single parent households? America. 43% of American children live without their father. 63% of youth suicides are from dad-deprived homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from dad-deprived homes. So there's a correlation, and those statistics go on and on and on, between what Dr. Warren Farrell calls the boy crisis in his book, to actually look to the underlying causality and the reasons for why some of our social ills and very disturbing events in our culture and are taking place. This propensity to focus so much on the issue of which we obviously needs focus, racial inequality, and rather than talking about the difference of the sexes and the difference of class. No one's talking about class. Who's looking out for the working class? I hear the woking class speaking so much and virtue signaling about it, but really bringing in policies that help our younger generations, particularly our younger generations of boys, who I think, if you look at all of the metrics, they're getting left behind. And the Me Too monologue needs to be a Me Too dialogue. It's not believe all women, it's listen to women, listen to the person who makes an allegation, investigate that allegation, work with the authorities. But it still should be, but more and more we're hearing it's not, innocent till proven guilty. But it's more guilty till proven innocent, or guilty till proven more guilty. And I think there are some laws that aren't helping. Obviously, attorneys interpret those laws specific ways, and they find ways around it to suit a specific group or organization. And
or line their own pockets.
well, there's that as well. And look, there are multi layers to this. It's similar to the conversation I have often about feminism. You know, I don't think we can look at feminism in a silo. I think there are, you know, for me, we can break it down just in a generalized way to two groups of feminists: equality, empowerment, factual feminists, people like Christina Hoff Sommers and Camille Paglia, philosophers who've been studying this for decades. And I'm with them. But then there's the other side of radical third and fourth wave feminists who want to do away with the family unit, don't see men as a viable, productive part of culture and society, and have really gone out there to sow the seeds of contempt and disagreement and division through these toxic masculinity catchphrases and smash the patriarchy and these intersectionalist rallying cries that just set group against group, and don't respect the fact that individuals, both men and women, can be good and evil. And you know, when you look at the stats as well, they are harrowing. You know, 4,000 children a day lose a parent in family law courts. Where do those children go? You add on top of that stat that states are reimbursed $6,000 for every child they place into foster care. And it's usually the CPS or the DCFS who are the facilitators of that. So there is a part to this system that's grown so big that people working within the system, who one could argue are just doing their jobs, there is no oversight. There is no, family law is not, divorce courts are not subject to oversight from the Supreme Court. There's no executive branch. In fact, they write the family law code books themselves. They are the state bar associations. And the lack of ethics, the lack of due process, the lack of presumption of innocence is just a melting pot for family breakdown. In fact, it encourages it, not only incentivizes it. So I think there are people within the system who are obviously taking advantage of this and becoming very wealthy at the expense of horrific injustices to, and I'm not talking about the parents that, you know, there are men that are bad and commit acts of domestic violence, but when you look at the statistics, and the majority of allegations of domestic violence are false and unprovable, and they don't move from a temporary phase to a permanent phase because of that, and you actually, you compare that and contrast that with what we're told in the media and through the media, that men are violent, women are victims, in a simple trope. It's not the case. In serious rates of intimate partner violence actually dropped over the last 15 years, but the disparity is 48 to 52% male on female, female on male. So we're almost equal in the rates there. So why we can't have a more balanced conversation, I think part of this is the devaluation of man and males and fathers, and some of that I think we may not be able to ever overcome, particularly when I see people who fight and serve our country and for our freedoms, and they are seen these days as, if they don't align with one particular ideology, they're the other 50%. They are, insert the colloquialist, you know, negative, they're all white or right, or they're, you know, neo-Nazi, or they're, you know, we have to move beyond this. Like, we really do. And I think we've seen in the gubernatorial race in Virginia, you know, Youngkin running. Of course, you know, the system of politics is set up, and we don't need to dive too much into politics. It's set up that you have to run, if you want any chance, one of the two major parties. But I think parents voted on over politics. They really, for the first time, the last year and a half, saw what their children were being taught, the books they were learning from, and they got educated. And it was really disturbing to me to see that father handcuffed and thrown to the ground and removed from I think it was Loudoun County, the parents
That's right.
association. Yeah, it was the
Child
teachers
was
association.
raped in a bathroom. Right.
I mean, when you know, and this is the danger we have with our culture and mainstream media reactivity and anti-social media is the immediate and how that tied into Merrick Garland talking about domestic terrorists and hey, come on, this is whatever side you're on. This is a parent whose 13-year-old daughter had been raped and wanted to speak to the school board and was not only didn't get to speak, but was handcuffed and treated like. So I don't know, you know, there is obviously more coming out about the details of that case, but it's ludicrous and really ignorant to suggest that, and I think this is why it didn't work as well. I think we're losing the ability to just say as Democrats, oh, you know, vote for us or you're going to get an incarnation of President Trump. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's going to keep working anymore because, and the reaction as well, frankly, after that was astonishing, not surprising, but still astonishing by some of the mainstream media news punditry in terms of their justification for like, let's learn some lessons here. The extreme, radical, progressive arm of the Democratic Party will drag the Democratic Party and the DNC down rather than lift it up. There has to be a little bit of a reckoning going on, I think.
Do you believe that there's any sort of greater plan to undermine and dismiss and render men in society obsolete? Or do you think it's just the natural byproduct of, again, a misguided sense of trying to lift others up, right? Like, I think it's really easy to say that, like, we're trying to lift up minorities, we're trying to give women equal rights. And so this is the banner that's being flown. And I wonder if that's the true intent and it's creating some unintended consequences, or if the intent is truly to do away with manliness and masculinity in men as this, you know, tyrannical patriarchy of society. Is it that deliberate, or is that just a byproduct of people and organizations and powers attempting to do good and right?
Yeah, great question. I think it's probably a combination of both, and maybe many other things too. You know, the predetermined strategy. I think back to 1969. There was a meeting of the feminist movement in New York, and there was a split because the more militant feminists decided, well, they wanted and they were successful in their strategy of pivoting the media message away to focus on two words. And those two words, and this is 1969, those two words were toxic masculinity. So we see decades later, it gets seeded into our, you know, our public conversation and our almost kind of zeitgeist of our vernacular.
Yeah.
And so that was a very premeditated focus on how can we instill this message that is hate-filled towards men to achieve our agenda and our goals. And I think at the same time, on the other side, and there are probably more examples of that. And you know, people may have examples of you know, groups of men wanting to do the same. But I'm just talking about from my perspective, where I see the pendulum swing. It's kind of a byproduct of our culture and society over time. That there is a somewhat of a hierarchy, and how we can address those systemic inequalities in a way that we can also catch it when it goes too far the other way, and also be mindful of everyone being involved in that, because we can't talk about race without talking about religion and sex and all of the identity politics groups, and then gender and so on and so forth. And there's a major difference between equality and equity. And I don't think people understand these differences of equity or equality of outcome and equality of opportunity. America is a land, a brave, bold new experiment of opportunity. And in its short history, there are things that it's deeply and should be deeply ashamed of, and learn from that and unpack that shame and be able to keep mindful of the history. But at the same time, there are things in America that America's personality should be deeply proud of. And so how do we counterbalance the pride and the shame, and keep moving forward in a way that includes as many people in the conversation as possible without falling prey to the trap of talking from an identity politics group mentality of me talking on behalf of my entire community. Well, what is that community? You know, blokes called Greg who were born in Northern England in 1968, or every person with the same pigmentation of skin as mine. I mean, the list in between is endless. So yeah, it's a tricky one to unpack, isn't it, Ryan?
Well, yeah. And I think that's why we have these conversations, and we need to continue to have these conversations, even in disagreement. And I don't think you and I disagree on a lot. I'm sure there are some things, but we need to open our mouths and our hearts to listen to these things and hear these things. As you were talking about uh, the way that organizations like the government, for example, wield these tools. And I'm not talking about any particular side of the aisle. They both use them. I take one example would be the left trying to introduce, packing the Supreme Court. I'm like, well, that sounds really fine and dandy until you're on the other side of the equation. And then all of a sudden that's a problem. So I think the solution, as simple as it sounds, it's not easy to implement, is just being truthful, like being honest. Like, for example, you take freedom of speech. You're most people, I think, are great proponents of freedom of speech until they hear something they don't like.
Well, hence why it's so important, if you value freedom of speech, to fight for your quote unquote enemy's freedom of speech.
Yes, 100%.
Particularly if someone disagrees with you. Like, I remember on my show, I invited on one of the heads of Antifa and the Proud Boys, not because I agree with either of them or their particular group ideologies, but because until we can break through that pre-existing and at least see a chink in the armor or a commonality, that's freedom of speech. Now, the line of incitement to violence, obviously, it's important to call that out, and it can be very difficult to find out where that line is.
Well, yeah, because incitement to violence is subjective. There isn't an objective metric for that. So I had posted something earlier, I think it was yesterday, in fact, and somebody said, well, you're inciting violence. I'm like, what in the world are you talking about? And I have no doubt that individual actually believes that's what he said is true. It's not true, but it's subjective, right? And that's the challenge.
Yeah, and I think, when we hear a lot that words are violence,
right.
And this, I call it, the speech police, the linguistic manipulation, that's part of, people who are drinking the Coca-Cola. The strategy focuses on language for a very good reason. You don't need to change the law and that's particularly difficult to do if you can change the meaning of the words written in the law. This tendency to hold adjectives at gunpoint until trembling they confess to being verbs, and saying that your words are violence and I don't feel safe. And you know what, words, if you can slate my family and my mother, and you can say a lot of things, and you could say it very angrily and vociferously. Ultimately, I might feel threatened. If I have an option to, leave the room, if I have an option to, if there's a remedy that I can find, if I can just not be in the presence of, but it's not physical violence. And
right.
And I think, finding that, finding the middle ground where we can be a bit more reasonable. I hear a lot about the offense Olympics. Well, I subscribe to the Ricky Gervais school of thought, which is offense is not given, it's only taken. And if you choose to take it, then it's on you. But, if you don't like what he or any other comedian has to say, don't buy a ticket to the show. Don't buy a ticket to the webcast. Don't follow them on social media. And if you're outraged, then sure, you have the right to speak up and be outraged. I'm going to protect your right to be outraged. But it doesn't mean to say that you're right.
Well, but we also love outrage. We actually, I listen to some of these political pundits and the talking heads, and because it's entertaining, and I realize there's an entertainment factor, at least I'm honest about that. But when you hear those individuals, they're talking about the other side of the aisle and you pretend like you're all pissed off and riled up and bothered. But at the same time, you're the one who, me included, I'm the one who tunes in because I like to be bothered about trivial things that the quote unquote other side is doing. Yes, I pretend like I'm outraged and it's this like huge like problem. And also I keep buying the ticket. I keep paying for it. I buy the subscription. I give my time and energy attention to it because I like it. But
Yeah,
we have to admit that, I think,
yeah,
and
no,
if
I
more
think
people
you're right.
did, maybe they,
I think we'd be better off, right? You just
right.
and accepting it. No, I think part of it is punditry, and the rise of political punditry on television. I think from the '60s onwards, the political debate and how pundit and the pressure on pundits as well, because there is pressure. You don't want to get your point across, and you only have a limited amount of time. And as well if you're going to be questioned or pressured, or someone's going to speak over you, or like, where's your sound bite? Because people want to have their sound bites to pull from, and where as well, in terms of the conversation, the broader conversation. Do you are you adding to the noise by buying the ticket and being a part of it and being outraged and clickbait, and you're being led down this garden path, or you're leading yourself? So I think how we have this conversation in terms of, I think that's why podcasts, long form podcasts came about, because we can talk about these issues in a kind of have more time rather than a reactivity, clickbaity, non-collaborative, or at least a more civil discourse. Let's put it that way, and people can comment and have at least have some sort of say and keep the conversation going. This is a part to us, so where the conversation goes, who knows? But yeah, I think we have such a disruptive, divisive model within the algorithms of social media, that it's like, who's leading who here? Are we being led by the technology, or are we able to kind of break that dopamine addiction and that device dependency and get off the screen, put the device down, and find some relief away from the maddeningness of the crowd and the conversation?
Yeah, I would like to say it's the latter, but if I'm being honest, it's the former, that we are being led and we don't want to admit it. So we pretend like we have control over it and we can pick and choose. But, ultimately it's all fed to us and we buy into it. Look, I want to go back though to your own story. One thing you said is that you had some false accusations and allegations from your ex-wife. So was she your ex-wife at the time, or were you two still married? And what was the relationship like leading up to that point? Were there any indicators or red flags or awareness of what could be coming down the pipe?
Yes, we were married. No, there were no indicators, none whatsoever. It was a 10-word false accusation.
Well, what was it?
It was she was out of town, and she called the police and said, you have to go to my house. My husband's confused. And they said, we can't go to the house if he's confused. And she said, well, what do you need to hear? Do we need to hear he's a threat to himself or the children? And then she called back and, created the false allegation. And what then tumbled the dystopian spiral after that. And eventually, you see, you can undo, you can find justice, but by that point it's months and months later, and you can't go back in time and untarnish your reputation and get your life back. It's too late. And I think that's what I learned, was that the value, and it's broader culturally right now, Ryan. We have this culture of victimhood, which is the new social currency, and its economy is booming. Victimology is being weaponized and hyper incentivized. And it's very difficult we have to treat allegations seriously, particularly in the area of false allegations of, say, domestic violence. We have to. It's incumbent upon us as a society to make sure that the most vulnerable among us are protected. But we cannot have a system with a catch-all where jurisprudence is upended and the burden of proof is on the accused rather than the accuser. That's why we did away with the Salem witch trials. We learned the lessons of the Spanish Inquisition. But we have this system where the super weapon, particularly in family law, of the false allegation has become the go-to playbook that guarantees a win every time It guarantees the estate and custody and all of the cash and beautiful cash and prizes of divorce. So it's a technique this I call it the silver bullet of high conflict divorce. And it's a technique and tool that's been weaponized for financial gain. And it's, there's many factors as to what led us there and here. But part of that is a piece of legislation that President Biden introduced in 1974, the Violence Against Women Act. It was a series of law enforcement grants that shifted the focus away from the problems of the relationship and the family to a law enforcement approach to domestic violence that resulted, again, in another shift from the prior discretionary approach to a dispatch call, to mandatory arrest or detainment policies. And all this money was created by the Violence Against Women Act for stop grants. And to qualify for these stop grants, law enforcement had to adopt these policies of mandatory arrest. And of course, this became more ingrained with high-profile cases like O.J. Simpson. It's laws like that and laws like there was another piece of legislation introduced called the Adoption and Safe Families Act in 1974 that offers financial incentives to the states that increase adoption numbers. So we're incentivizing adoption. So to receive the adoption incentives or bonuses, there is actually bonuses. A local child protection service agency or DCFS must have more children. They must have, it's an ugly way to say it, but they must have more merchandise to sell. And funding becomes available when a child is placed in foster homes with strangers or placed in as often happens as well, in a mental health facility. And it's called medicated, usually against the parents' wishes. So parents are being victimized by a system that profits for holding children even longer, bonuses for not returning children to their parents and families. I think this is a growing global criminal and political scandal, that when we have the judiciary involved, knowingly or unknowingly, in child trafficking, and the child trafficking of children, of poor parents, the most vulnerable among us, happens across the board, but particularly vulnerable to this are poor parents who are targeted to lose their children because they don't have the wherewithal or the financial resources to hire an attorney or an advocate in any way to fight the system. And being poor and lacking housing, proper housing, doesn't mean that your children should be removed from you for profit. So very few people are talking about this because it's who wants to, There's too many people profiting. There's too much money to be made from the selling and the incentivized, moving, let's say generously, of our children.
Well, I mean, yes, there's those financial incentives, but also it sounds right. If a parent, for example, is financially destitute, then it sounds right that that's not going to be a great environment for children. So it's very easy to pass off on that because you can say, whether you're really motivated by this or not, that you do truly care about the well-being of those children involved.
Yeah, not having financial resources or being a particular socioeconomic bracket doesn't preclude you from being a great parent. There are people I know, or I have known or seen or witnessed, who are extremely comfortable financially, who are terrible parents. And by terrible, I don't mean horrific, but just they could be better parents. And there are people I know.
Sure, it's not the only metric.
Right.
So with your wife coming, or your ex-wife coming with this, this shocker to you, over a span of 6 years now, maybe a little longer, have you ever gotten to the root cause of this? Was there some sort of animosity or contention or jealousy, or mental illness? I don't know. Where did this even come from?
Gosh, how long do you have?
Yeah.
Look, there's conjecture as to why. I was speaking with Dr. Drew Pinsky recently, and I told him that, my ex-wife was diagnosed with panic disorder, and she had medication at the time. She hadn't been taking her medication. And he said, I don't know about panic disorder. It sounds like psychopathy. I think some, without going deep into the weeds of psychology and psychotherapy, I think there's a lot dormant in the unconscious and subconscious. in terms of family of origin. And that can come up in a moment. It can, like a Vesuvius, and just snap the psychological system to do things and act in ways that are so counterintuitive to the person that you've been. I mean, I've said this many times. The woman I was married to for 20 years without any serious issues was not the woman from March 5th onwards. I mean, she was the same woman, but she used to be an ethical, decent, law-abiding, I mean, great scheduler of our family, really marvelous in many ways in terms of the role she played within our family unit and our marriage. But, you look to the sins of the father and the perceived sins of her father, her own mother, twice divorced, and a man-hating, I mean, true misanthropist in many regards. And how the system comes in, CPS comes in and threatens, unless you do this. I mean, they literally, it was only months later I saw it in a report, they literally wrote, unless you get a restraining order and file for divorce, your children are at risk of going into foster care. There's the money aspect, the CPS has to meet its numbers and make its money. And we were a family that, there was no issue of any, we lived in an affluent community, boys at private school, members of the local country club. There was no drama or there'd been no issue with law enforcement because there was no issue. Like, we were a good, sound, strong embodiment of what a wonderful family should be. So if it could happen to us, which it did, and in terms of my ex-wife, I think, the original title for my book when I was working through it was how to survive when your spouse wants you dead and has the legal means and ways to kill you. And it was, it is a kind of people have chuckled at that, but she literally wanted me dead, like literally wanted me physically dead, like to end me. And when you think about that, having two young children and having lived 20 years with someone, to snap to that degree, aside from the circumstances where you're carrying that much anger, resentment, vengeance, and bitterness around, that you want to get the ammunition within the family system, family law system, and the legal system to kill another human being. Not that I could ever be dead in my children, our children, our son's psychology, anyway. That's a particular brand of disturbing. And you mentioned about was she mentally ill? Well, what's interesting was all the way through the 5+ years of family law, I was the one that had to be subjected to psychological evaluations.
Of course, sure.
Evaluations, independent, and she would pick who the doctor was. And I included both in my book at the end, in the final chapter, for a reason, because they are extremely telling of how, even in 2015, after extensive psychological testing by an independent court-ordered psychologist chosen by her, that it's evident that I'm not psychologically disturbed. I don't have any diagnosis of mental illness, etc., etc. But the one person who should have been evaluated was the one person who never was. Mm-hmm. And we should also be mindful as well that having a diagnosis of a major mental illness is not a crime. We should be empathic to that and understanding of that. But it comes through this book, the DSM-5, the kind of psychiatric book that kind of, they have to find a diagnosis within the book. But when I took both of the evaluations to court. In 2015, the judge he summarily just washed it aside with a sweeping sentence of, I don't care about that. He didn't even look at it. And the evidence in that was so damning of my sons as well, the parental alienation and the brainwashing that they'd endured from such a young age, and how they wanted to be with their father. I love you, Dad. Or the quotes, I love you, Dad. I love you, Dad. Can't we live with you? Why can't we see you? Why can't we be with you half the time? The judge doesn't care. I think part of them is stuck in this 1960s outlook of, mother is the major and only caregiver, and father is the breadwinner. And, children, particularly boys, They need fathering and mothering. They need balanced parenting, particularly when there are biological parents who are together, who are present, who are loving, who are meeting every need of the child, and the family unit is intact. Is it any wonder that I think the greatest threat to Western civilization today that's not being talked about is the breakdown of the family? It's a national health or international, actually, global health emergency that would solve so much if we could bring about some small reforms and improvement, but will also cause and is causing catastrophic devastation to individuals across the Western Hemisphere, and particularly in America, where, as I said, who is the world leader in children growing up in single-parent families, is single-parent households? It's America. Why? There's a lot of reasons why, and we need to really talk about them.
I'm just so fascinated by this because, I've had guys that have reached out to me or shared something about their own personal family dynamic. And they'll say things like, my wife snapped or my wife changed or she's a completely different person right now. And my knee jerk reaction, with all due respect to you, is no, like there's red flags. There's something that you overlooked that you decided not to address because of some other reason, or you were afraid of what would happen. Like, surely. And as I hear you speak, and I believe what you're saying, it's fast. I don't even know what other word to use to describe it. It's just such a fascinating thing. And I'm not trying to make light of your situation. It's hard for me to fathom. It's very hard for me to fathom and understand how
I
this
can
happens.
I can relate to that, because if I'd have heard my story 6, 7 years ago, it would have been just as difficult for me to comprehend and understand. And I think this is the challenge with why there hasn't been improvement or reform, is because unless it's happened to you, unless you've entered the star chamber of family law, unless you've been removed from your children summarily by the institutions and of power that are supposed to be impartial and fair, unless you've experienced the billable hours to a degree that's insane and inane, unless you've been the victim or the casualty of a false allegation and gone into court and realized that, oh, criminals get more rights than parents and partners and spouses in this legal quasi-kangaroo court system, it's hard to make sense of. So, how do we have this conversation if, well, like you say, and it's understandable, oh, there had to be something, well, of course there's something on both sides. Of course there's always issues, minor issues within a marriage. And if left unaddressed, they're going to grow over time, and people sometimes have a hard time coming back to be vulnerable and being intimate and find a way to have that conversation. But at the same time, that doesn't mean to say that even if there are irreconcilable differences, that one side can have the super weapon and have ultimately, for the most part, because I understand that sometimes there are mothers and women who are respondents and mothers and women who are treated unfairly. But if we look at the evidence, it's predominantly, given the way the system works and the approach to it. In my experience, and I am a man, but I have also spoken with women as well. It's men and fathers. Like we have to be able to acknowledge that there are the punishment, quote unquote, or the response is so outrageous compared to the perceived infraction of behavior. So if a spouse had behaved in a certain way, if you had I don't know, erred or transgressed, Ryan, you wouldn't expect your wife to call law enforcement, make up a story, knowingly damning you, removing you, making you homeless and destitute, removing you from your children's lives, with no ability, legally or otherwise, to remedy that false accusation. And that's pretty scary, but we all want to believe it wouldn't happen to us. 20 years married, no incidents other than the odd disagreement here or there, and the odd slightly raised voice on both sides,
Sure.
of frustration. So it's gone on and it's going on. So I get your what? How could that happen? There's got to be
Right.
something.
What is the situation now, if you're willing to discuss and share with your boys?
Well, when I realized that I'd fought for 5 years and they were suffering just incalculably psychologically and through their adolescent years, and the inordinate amount of money, the millions of dollars that had been spent, particularly by my ex-wife, I think is nearly $1.8 million on her attorney, who summarily left the case when she couldn't afford her anymore and is now suing her, I think, for nearly $500,000 with no relief. My sons have suffered life-changing. My boys were brilliant, beautiful, and still are brilliant and beautiful boys. But no child should have to endure the sudden, shocking, instant removal of one parent from a family home based on a false allegation.
It's almost,
So,
I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but just this is my perspective. It's almost worse than you dying.
well, I talk about this a lot because I've talked to a lot of parents who've been through this. And I talk about living grief, suicide by living grief. There are parents, there are children who no longer have a father, in rare instances, mothers, because it's unbearable, because the system doesn't provide relief. And when the meaning of your life, the deepest, most meaningful purpose of your life is removed from you unjustly and unfairly, and there is no recourse to find relief and remedy, many parents decide not to go on.
Well,
And
look, Greg, I'm not necessarily talking about it from that perspective. I'm talking about it from a child's perspective.
yep,
Losing a father or mother
yep.
to an accident, for example, while tragic, I think is less tragic than what they've had to endure over the course of the last 6 years.
Well, there's a finality to death.
Right.
When we lose someone, we care about there is a finality. Even if it's sudden and shocking, there is a process. You can move through that grieving process. Living grief, or ambivalent grief, that I talk about, where there is no definitive end. It's like the purgatory of the unknowing, the inescapability of the trauma, the terror of the existential angst of will this ever be remedied and solved, and relief brought about. That's really it's a burden of epic proportions to carry, because it can strike at any time. You can't move on. How does a parent move on from the sudden and catastrophic loss of the deepest meaning of their life? And how does a child move forward through life, not affected in so many negative ways, of which they're not aware of as children, but will manifest in many ways as they grow to become adults and maturate? It's no wonder if we look at some of the situations that have happened in our culture over the last however many years. It seems to be one prevailing similarity, and that's the lack of fathers in the home. And again, this isn't blame and fault. I try not to deal in blame and fault. It's about, how can we be more responsible and talk about this? Whether it's rioting on the streets, whether it's school shootings, whether it's, of course, the individual has to be held accountable, but what's this one factor that keeps coming up that's not talked about? Dad deprivation. What's causing that? How can we improve a system to keep more fathers at home, and at least keep more fathers connected in a co-parenting way with their children? Because if we don't, it's generationally, it's just going to get exponentially worse.
I agree. I interrupted you when you were talking about where the situation is with your boys right now.
Yeah, look, I wasn't able to affect, and I tried for years to get relief and to be a part of their lives again. And as I said, when you have two generations and a war chest of money to fight, where already one is behind the curve, I wasn't able to save my sons from, or allow affect enough legally for me to remain a part of their lives as a father. So I that's why I started, one of the reasons I started the Respondent and the charitable extension of the Respondent, Children and Parents United, CPU, to help other fathers and mothers and parents and children navigate our zero-sum divorce laws, develop programs and workshops to keep them out of our court system and our legal system. If we need to keep people out of court in family law because there is no justice. There is for both parents, both sides, and all, even the extended family, who we forget about a lot of the time. The aunts and uncles, the cousins, the grandparents. Oh, the stories, Ryan, of the grandparents I've spoken to, who, because they're the grandparent of one side who happens to be the respondent, their grandchildren are lost to them. And that grandparent-grandchild bond is super special and vital. That tethering of that is so vital intergenerationally for the child and our older generation, who've really earned not just the right, but they've shown the responsibility to be connected to their kin.
How has this impacted your career? I mean, obviously you're in a very liberal leaning career. And how are you viewed? I mean, even the things that you've been saying in the last hour on this podcast are probably not looked at favorably within your professional community. So I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, I'm not, and I probably should be, but I'm not that concerned about the perceptions of me. I know who I am. I know my value system, and I know my flaws, and I know my strengths, I think, but I also know what I don't know, is that I don't know what other people's perceptions are of me. I did a convention for a TV show called 24 the other day that I was on, and a troll hopped in the chat and just made some baseless nonsense up about me that, I have to laugh at because it's just silly. It's kids play on the school ground. I did a show where someone said, "Oh, have you seen your Wikipedia page? You're a vocal supporter of President Trump and Charlie Kirk." And I'm like, "What? Are you kidding me?" Like, not that there's any, each to their own. We're all individuals and have agency to support what we want, but that was so far from the truth. It's not, now it's been corrected to the truth, which was I was a vocal supporter and publicly endorsed Andrew Yang through the Democratic primaries, because I thought him and Tulsi Gabbard were the only two that weren't infested with identity politics. So, as a registered Democrat, do I have some beliefs that I think skew more to the right? Well, yeah, I think we talked about this. I think the extreme left has gone so far left that I haven't moved right. I've just gone, wow, that's like, what is going on? Like, I haven't moved. But they've moved so far, and self-critiquing that, I'll do that. But have I been affected? Sure. I mean, Hollywood, I know that people are afraid to speak out. I've spoken to a couple of people in very high positions of power, one a studio head, and they are afraid they make decisions based on fear now rather than on talent and creativity. It's like, by the numbers. And if we're being creative on an equality of outcome, there's only one way that will go, and that will be this bland, the product and the movies and the TV shows we make will be affected in ways that will just not be good for our culture and for our entertainment. And so I think we have to be mindful to talk about that. But people perceive, if I don't drink the Kool-Aid or the Coca-Cola and say one thing, if I'm not in agreement with one comment someone makes, suddenly I'm a transphobe, racist,
Right.
misogynist, etc., etc. And the irony is, of course, when you do a little bit of research, that person who's who's accusing you of being these particular character assassins or these word names is the very thing they're accusing you of. I wrote this quote once. I'm not who you think I am. You are who you think I am. And so
I saw that on your website. Even just today, I saw that. I had to stop and think about it for a minute, but I'm like, that's pretty good. That's really good.
You know what it does? It speaks to that mass projection. And I think we do have a mass mind virus or this ideological projection going on that's almost like a collective Munchausen's by proxy. I think we have people who've gone through the academy who've been taught and told what to think, not how to think. They haven't been taught critical thinking, how to think critically in a way that disagrees or agrees with, but you can agree to disagree or disagree to agree, however you look at it, but just critical thinking rather than understanding the nuances within the debate of things like critical race theory. So, I had Chris Rufo on my show, and it's very difficult to talk about because there is nuance to it. It is important to improve and study race and the history of discrimination in America from the indigenous peoples, on through. I mean, the irony is, of course, that I'm English and American, so I'm conflicted moment by moment because my people wanted to escape the religious tyranny in England and came to America, but also my people were there and got were part. So, and
you're just the worst of the worst that ever could have lived.
I first heard about the Boston Tea Party, and it sounded like a fun historical event I wanted to be part of because we'd all sip tea, drinking around there. I realized, oh no, that was not how. And then I found out my great grandfather was my 24th great grandfather was Robert the Bruce. So then I was conflicted with that Celt heritage within me. Like, oh, so the Scots fighting the English, and I was born in England. So where did we begin this, and end the conversation,
Well, and I mean, you look at that and none of that has anything to do with you. So you can be your own person now, but it's just not enough in modern culture. You can't, it's not enough that you didn't support Trump, for example. You have to be anti-Trump.
That's right.
It's not enough that you are not racist and that you try as hard as you can not to see color and look at people by the merit of who they are. You have to be anti-racist. Like everything has to be the opposite of, what is culturally acceptable. So it's just a wild time to live. There's so many incredible things about the time in which we live, and there's so much bullshit, and there's no other way to say it.
There's so much moral hypocrisy. It reminded me, I've mentioned this before, but it reminded me of when we talk about the conversation on race. I don't think we should dwell there because I actually don't like the way that this entire conversation is the framework of it, not with you, but just broader aspect. When Morgan Freeman was asked by the interviewer, how do we get rid of race in America? And he said, how about we start with, I don't call you a white man and you don't call me a black man. Now I get it. It's simplistic and it's somewhat pithy and all the rest of it, but there is something in that. If you look to the needle of identity politics and what primarily you identify as, if we're having to go down the self-identification route.
You're opening an entirely different can of worms with that one.
Right. Well, let's not. Let's come back to family law. And what are some of the solutions? I mean, how I mentioned as well a lot about the CPS and DCFS. We need independent audits of every state. We need to actually see how much money this profiteering, racketeering is making each state, and the CPS and DCFS departments within each state. We need a congressional hearing. It's long overdue, decades long overdue. We need to urgently remove and abolish for good the state financial incentives that have turned the CPS into a business. That their business plan, which they've enacted very well, is to take children and separate families for money. We need to open family court and remove the confidentiality laws. And we need to give parents their rights verbally and in writing. And in extreme cases or high conflict cases, that involve removing children and terminating the rights of parents, they must be heard in front of a jury. They must be. Domestic violence in particular, we could rid the whole or at least greatly reduce the false allegations of domestic violence if we put domestic violence in criminal court. So if there's an accusation of domestic violence, those who are alleged, will be investigated. If there is evidence, then that goes before a jury and tried. They are innocent till proven guilty, but if they are found guilty by a judge or jury and jury of their peers beyond a reasonable doubt, then they must be seriously dealt with. Because violence of any kind is wrong, but violence towards the most vulnerable among us in a family setting with children involved. Children should not be witness to physical violence and individuals and parents. And, you know, mothers and fathers should not be subjected to physical violence. So we have to find a better way within our system to adjudicate this, to ease the suffering, as well as, you know, improving the legal system so that these unethical attorneys and the crime syndicate that operates within family law for money is held accountable.
Well, I know you're championing all of this, and I really appreciate that. And also, I commend you. You know, I talk with a lot of guys who go through varying degrees of difficulty in life, and I think yours, not to compare, ranks right up there with the worst of the worst, quite honestly. But I commend you for taking this and turning it into something and becoming an advocate so it doesn't happen to other people. I think it'd be very easy for you to become bitter. I'm sure there's probably some of that,
No,
to
I'm not.
withdraw. No, good.
No, I'm really not bitter. And withdraw, maybe a little. I withdrew for a little for a while. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I commend where you've taken it. I mean, it takes a strong man to be able to do that, and I honor you for doing that. Where can we go to learn more about the work that you're doing? And just as, if not more importantly, is how do we support what you're doing? Are there organizations, whether it's yours or others, that we need to be aware of, that we need to donate to, that we need to become advocates for? What is it that we can do as men to support your work and make sure our kids are being taken care of?
Thank you, Ryan. Well, first of all, I want to thank you because, you know, having me on and allowing me the platform to speak about this is wonderful. I think, you know, my charity, CPU, Children and Parents United, is a place that can be found at the Respondent.com. All the information about, you know, my show, my cause, why I do what I do, and the book, The Respondent. There is a free downloadable ebook as well called The Code, which is available for those who have read The Respondent. They use the coupon code and they get the book, The Code, for free. That provides immediate interventions into well-being for people who are struggling through interpersonal relationships, and specifically if they find themselves in a courtroom or a family courthouse, family law courthouse. There are workshops and programs that are cost-effective that we're developing, mediation programs. We're setting up a law firm, all through CPU, Children and Parents United. We have a very dedicated but small board of people. We have some great volunteers as well. So really, you know, donations help through the Respondent.com. There's our nonprofit page, CPU. Sharing the information, talking with others, reaching out. We're actually about to set up a billboard campaign to have billboards around courthouses, so that attorneys, judges, people can see the effect that what goes on inside that courtroom is having, and empowering individuals as well, wherever they live, to meet the targeted goal of maybe raising some money to get the billboard paid for. And then our organization can deal with the logistics and the messaging and find the space and put some pressure on. I think we need to put some pressure on this system that doesn't value family, that's devaluing fathers, and that is putting mothers too often in single parent environments without help from men who want to be helpful. So I would say, yeah, the Respondent.com is the place, and CPU, Children and Parents United, is the organization.
Well, we're going to sync it all up, and I'm going to spread the message far and wide. And you continue to share with me how I can personally help and what I can do, because I believe in you. I believe in your message, and I know how important it is. You know, I talk a lot about men, and I talk a lot about our young men and our young daughters, and making sure they get everything they need to thrive. And the work you're doing is providing that. So again, I honor you, and I appreciate you coming on the show to talk about this stuff.
Thank you, Ryan. Right back at you as well. And, you know, it's been wonderful chatting with you over 2 parts. I'm glad we got the second part done. And
Yes, me too.
anything I can do for you down the line, you just let me know.
Will do.
It's been a real pleasure, really.
I'm sure we'll make it happen again. I would love to have you on anytime. So
We'd love to. You know, I just secured funding for the development of a feature film documentary about this, about family and, you know, family war. So I think we'd love to have you involved, you know, on camera and that, if you're willing, down the line.
Absolutely.
Get it put
100%.
out there. Great.
All right.
Thanks,
Thanks, Greg.
Ron. Appreciate it.